There really is only one real question in American politics today, only one central issue, and that is simply why is the United States run by a pedophile, rapist, narcissist, con artist, mafia boss? The question is simple, but the answer is rather complex, and it forces us to think about the American Republic, about institutions and civilization itself, all the critical historical and philosophical foundations of human civilization, which have been essentially excluded from all political discourse in the United States today. First, Donald Trump runs and does not run the United States government at the same time. He has made large swaths of the federal government his own private company belonging to the Trump organization and dealt out for benefit for his friends in the Middle East and Israel in the so-called Peace Forum, Peace Board, and other secret billionaire players around the world. In that respect, in terms of immediate interest for his family and the efforts undertaken to promote their own personal family interests and that of other mafia families around them, yes, Donald Trump is the focus for everything. At the same time, vast swaths of the government and of American society and society around the world have been outsourced to multinational corporations, especially IT firms, now AI firms, who run them as a technological, techno-totalitarian system. And in that respect, Donald Trump lacks the bandwidth, the sophistication, and the mental capacity to really understand anything. So he basically has outsourced all of that to third players, to the invisible IT players, multinational banks, etc. Like the Terminator, and I think the movie The Terminator is a good analogy for what we see in Donald Trump. The Terminator at the beginning has flesh and skin and looks human. But as the battle draws on and the flesh is torn away in the fight, it is revealed to us that the Terminator is essentially a ruthless metallic robot within, and that is all that is left at the end of the film. So also, in this case, in the fight concerning Donald Trump and his family and his corrupt pals in Washington and around the world, we have seen the damage done to the court system, to the federal government, to the civil service system, to the Congress, and to all the branches of the White House and the various different departments, the Department of State, Department of Energy, etc. And that has revealed to us that, in fact, as a result of profound shifts in American society, in the structure of our economy, in the structure of our politics, those branches of government defined by the Constitution and by accumulation of law and precedents have essentially become decoration, like the skin on the Terminator metallic robot. And they're being torn away. We're being forced to see the reality of how the United States is run as a ruthless multinational dictatorship. And that is part of a larger dictatorship of the entire world. And that I want to stress, that so many of the people who see themselves as against globalism and the financialization of everything, they say, and this is especially among those who unfortunately were led to support Donald Trump for good reasons on occasion, because people were led to believe that we have to stop the establishment of one world government. This was an enormous fraud, not because there wasn't a danger of one world government, but rather because one world government run by IT corporations, private equity, banks, and multinational corporations and the billionaires behind them has already been established. We already have one world government. The challenge for us is not to fight to keep it from emerging, but rather to create something to battle against it. And if the answer for the battle against one world government run by banks and corporations is to say we're just going to become anarchist farmers growing organic food, then clearly we're going to be destroyed. That we have to create our own global movement, which is organized, disciplined, and brave to battle against this deadly one world government which has already been established. But let's come back to the United States and what produced the Orange Man? What produced this rapist, narcissist, con man as president? Well, first, there is the decay of institutions over time. It is inevitable in the course of events, and we see this whether we're looking at the Roman Empire or the British Empire or many empires and great powers back into antiquity, that over time institutions decay. They collapse under the accumulation of various traditions and decadence and indulgence within the culture, which leads to a breakdown in governance and a breakdown in the relationship between those in power and those beneath them. This has happened over and over again, and the United States, now 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, has reached a critical moment in our evolution, which demands profound revolutionary change. Also related to the decay of institutions, whether it's the federal government, the courts, the Congress, or universities, or newspapers, or local government, or even the way our neighborhoods are run, the way in which we interact with our friends and family, that decay is also parallel to what we can call the treason of the intellectuals. Now, not every working person is able to have a profound understanding of technology, of science, of policy, of foreign relations, of the way in which this complex world must be treated by our nation, by the combinations of nations around the world, in order to maintain peace, to maintain the lives of our people and a sustainable future. That means we need specialists, people who have had the chance to get advanced degrees, advanced training, who understand science, who understand international relations. And those people play an inordinately important role in our society. What happened, especially over the last 50 years, is that the intellectuals, the educated people, the people from Harvard, from Princeton, Yale, and elsewhere, who we depended on to be lawyers, politicians, professors, researchers, etc., they have turned away from ordinary people, from working people, and they have sided against the working people with the billionaires and the established rich classes. Now, the reasons for that are complex, but basically they were bought out over time. And the ideologies, the principles in the American tradition, from the Declaration of Independence, from our political traditions, from George Washington through Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy, which stressed the engagement and the commitment of the citizen to the greater good, those traditions have faded away. And we had people, journalists, researchers, politicians, government officials, who were being paid directly in bribes, but also in all sorts of benefits that they got on the job and off the job, work for their kids, and they became the puppets, the pawns, the marionettes of the rich. And that meant that the ordinary people were misled in journalism and education, and in writing around the country by these intellectuals, and were unable to understand the horrific transformations taking place in the United States. That break between intellectuals and ordinary working people has been catastrophic for the United States. Another aspect that we cannot forget is what the famous German philosopher Rudolf Steiner called the karma of untruthfulness. Now, what Steiner meant by the karma of untruthfulness is to say that once you embrace untruthfulness, a lack of rigorous pursuit of truth, once you accept lies and established falsehoods as common sense, as something that you have to conform with, then the civilization, the nation, enters into a downward spin. We have seen this going back to the Kennedy assassination. That was really the beginning of this particular descent, but we saw it especially in the 9/11 incident, in which the World Trade Centers were destroyed, turned to dust using advanced technologies, and a totally fabricated story about what had happened was force-fed to the American people, and with the treason of the intellectuals was pushed on everyone. This was also repeated almost in identical form, but in a more serious manner around the world in the COVID-19 reign of terror, when medicine was used as a way to take over all of society and the economy, to create a slave state, and to force deadly poisons on people as vaccines. That untruthfulness, that fraudulent system was embraced, and that created a culture in the United States in which really anything would go. And it doesn't stop there. There were a whole series until the current day of false flag attacks, shootings in shopping malls, schools, and other setups to try and create chaos. There were targeted individual programs under special access programs to attack individuals as experiments or as political persecution. There were the efforts to counterfeit money through the Federal Reserve for private equity and banks. There was the use of derivatives and hedge funds, crypto crap, to create money by magic, to make billionaires in the IT sectors, in real estate, in hedge funds, in derivatives, out of nothing, through profound untruthfulness. So that culture, that civilization based on untruthfulness, on lies, is something which has long-term implications for how we run ourselves. And that created a space into which a brash, fraudulent figure like Donald Trump could walk into so easily, because our citizens have been so accustomed to embracing fraud in the most profound sense. At the same time, we should also recognize that this system that welcomed in Donald Trump, the destroyer, our Shiva, was affected above all by the radical concentration of wealth. Now, the problems that I related before all contributed to the concentration of wealth and control in the hands of a tiny number of families, in the hands of a tiny number of individuals in the United States and globally. In addition, we have to look at what created the post-war order, post-war common sense and policy in the United States, and why it has shifted so radically. And I think one can only understand this if one looks at the socialist traditions that were promulgated, especially in the Soviet Union, but also in the People's Republic of China and elsewhere from the 1920s on. Now, I'm not here to defend the programs of the Soviet Union and other socialist countries, but I do want to say that they had certain positive aspects to them, particularly in identifying the intersection of class interests, capital, and the exploitation of workers and the creation of fraudulent, manipulative ideologies. Moreover, countries like the Soviet Union put workers, at least in terms of rhetoric, at the center and created an ideology and philosophy and writings in the political sciences which offered a objective critique from a different perspective of how markets, how economics work. And that tradition influenced the United States profoundly from the 1930s on, especially under the Roosevelt administration, but all the way down through the Clinton administration. What it meant was that the United States was forced to reform itself, to embrace a vision of a more egalitarian society that expanded the potential found in the Constitution and in the Declaration of Independence. That expansion of the potential for a more egalitarian society created much of the culture of post-war United States. It was a world in which workers had certain guarantees, in which people did not start working in factories at the age of 9, in which general education was extended, in which things like Social Security and welfare to assure that working people had some basic support were embraced as common sense. So when those socialist traditions overseas disappeared in the 1980s and 1990s and were replaced by new systems which were essentially just as ruthless as the economic system in the United States and elsewhere, and sometimes even more ruthless, that was the end of that pressure on the United States, on intellectuals, on politicians and policymakers to create a more balanced, a more egalitarian society. And we've seen the slow and now accelerating slide back to where we were in the late 19th century. Another aspect of the change in American political culture that made Donald Trump possible was the strategic dumbing down of the population. This was done by multinational corporations and banks strategically and intentionally over a period of some 50 years. We can date it back to the 1950s, the effort to promote abstract art over art which had some political or social content to it, but it was also in the commercial advertising, in the creation of all sorts of movies for entertainment, etc., which got rid of any social, political content or awareness and replaced it with the sentimental, the emotional, and the exciting and titillating. That was really the way in which the intellectual level of Americans was dragged down. Now we have supercomputers in the United States that are calculating how to make Americans stupider, using algorithms, feeding them garbage through social media, and forcing them to engage in a culture through advertising around them, what's on TV, what's in movies and music, etc., which is intended to make them emotional, narcissistic, short-term in their thinking, and incapable of grasping this enormous conspiracy to destroy American society and make it a dictatorship of the rich, for the rich and by the rich. So we have to be concerned about this massive effort to dumb us down, because that has been critical to making someone like Donald Trump, who embraces emotional politics, possible. Finally, I think we have to consider the development of technology itself as related to the topics that I mentioned before, but also independent. So technology has been advancing rapidly. The ability of semiconductors following Moore's law, basically every 18 months or so, doubling the amount of processors that can be put on a chip at a reasonable expense every 18 months or so. This has meant that new technologies for surveillance, for predictive programming of citizens, of whole populations, of control of our entire system, including taking over money, taking over governance, and has now reached a level that an unprecedented ability to control all of the world, and especially all of the United States, faces us. We see these super rich using technology to attack us, to take over our money, to take over our government, and especially recently to introduce this insidious idea of AI, a black box concept, which doesn't really have any meaning to it, but what it essentially is, as a false god, is this system which will dictate to us what is true and what is not true, with the decision not based on the scientific method, not in any accessible and transparent way, but dictated from within by multinational corporations and banks and billionaires behind the curtains. Extremely, extremely dangerous. That also made the likes of Donald Trump and now many Trump-like figures dominating politicians, not just the Republican Party, throughout the Democratic Party, throughout the country, around the world, who have been promoted by this technology system, which essentially says that we don't need governments anymore. We can just have it all run by supercomputers. The entire world run by supercomputers, and get rid of all the middlemen, take over, and create concentration camps and smart cities to contain the rest of us, with a very, very dark future ahead. In order to combat this, there are many approaches that we must take. I would say that self-awareness of oneself, commitment to others to create a better world, the imagination to do so, a willingness to cut oneself off from technology, even at the risk of feeling isolated, in order to have one's own will and one's own ability to see what is potential in humanity, what's possible in humanity and in our country. These are critical steps. Bravery is absolutely necessary. One cannot beat these people that have created Donald Trump by just thinking about oneself. As the Chinese classic, the Tao Te Ching, says, Jisa Bishang, Jishang Bisa, which means in English, if one is willing to risk one's life, to take every risk, then in that process of determination, there will emerge real opportunities to survive and to go forward. But if one spends all one's time just trying to protect oneself, to try and survive, not take any chances, then that will condemn us to death. And that sort of thinking, I think, is critical for us. At the heart of the next stage in our revolution, in our attempt to reestablish a culture of civilization, a politics, a society based on people, based on nature, based on sustainability, based upon the foundations of us as living humans in a tradition, in a culture which can use technology on occasion, but which is not dominated by technology, is not exploited by technology, and certainly is not altered and transformed by technology. In order to achieve that, we really need to come back to science. Science is what we need desperately. We don't need more technology, we need less technology, but we need science. And what that means is science is the objective investigation of things, of reality, of how things work in a method, the scientific method, whereby one postulates, using one's imagination, how the world works. One investigates it using various tests to see if one's imagined explanations work or don't work, discarding those that don't describe the world as it's proven to be, and through this process, slowly coming down to understand things as they really are. We need science in education, we need science in the running of our society and politics. We don't need technology, which is a tool that can be helpful on occasion, but if there's no goal, no moral imperative behind it, becomes but a weapon for destroying us. And most importantly, we need citizens who will think scientifically, who will be able to think for themselves, starting with the basic understanding: I am a human in a specific historical moment. These things that I see before me should be investigated objectively, scientifically, using a established mode, approach for assessing what is true and what is false. And if our citizens, who are the foundations of our nation, of our republic, are scientific in their thinking, are committed to the community and to the nation, and are able to investigate the truth bravely, to discard and to remove those profound falsehoods like 9/11, like COVID-19, which have corrupted, like a cancer, the body politic. At that moment, we will see new potential. If we don't take that step as citizens, then I can guarantee you that if Donald Trump resigns tomorrow, he will be replaced by an equally false or even falser God, leading us down the path to perdition. Please join with me, join with us in pursuing science, in pursuing the moral good of the citizens of the United States and of our precious earth, and let us turn away from this karma of untruthfulness to create a government which is a real government rooted in truth, in ethics, and a commitment to the citizens who make up the nation.